Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you again this week. So we have the opportunity to welcome back Dr. Jake Grombach, who gave a wonderful talk just last quarter. He's back in a different capacity today to introduce our speakers and to moderate the discussion. So we thank him for that. And as usual, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. We will go through those at the end, and I will find you on the list and let you ask your question directly if that's what you would like, and also to follow up with any additional questions. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you to Dr. Grombach and the wonderful speakers today. And with that, I'll let Jake take over.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks for your work setting this up and organizing. I'm super excited to introduce a couple of really outstanding scholars. First, Jennifer Heerwig, who's an associate professor of sociology at Stony Brook University, where she studies campaign finance and political inequality, as well as the politics of corporate elites. And also to introduce Brian McCabe, associate professor of sociology at Georgetown, who is also the author of No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership. Their presentation today is called Participation in Seattle's Democracy Voucher Program, a comparison of the 2017 and 2019 election cycles. Really excited to have these sort of path-breaking scholars of campaign finance here and learn from them. Take it away.
Thanks, Jake. And thank you for hosting this seminar and allowing us the time to tell you about our work on democracy vouchers. So before I get started on the substance of today's talk, I wanted to take a moment to thank the folks at the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission. They have provided the data, the administrative data, to facilitate this project. They've answered endless questions about that data and intricacies of the program, and we really appreciate all of their support. I also wanted to acknowledge our benefactors. The Massive Data Institute at Georgetown, as well as the Piper Fund, have provided financial support for this research. So we are very, very grateful for all of that help. So the topic of today's talk is the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program and the 2019 election cycle. Now, for those of you who don't live in Seattle, you may not be familiar with the Democracy Voucher Program. So I'm going to talk you through the details of the program in a bit, but just as an initial pass, the Democracy Voucher Program is at the forefront of new public financing programs. So programs that change the way elections are financed, or where the money comes from to fund political campaigns. Our focus today is going to be how this program, the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program, may have built a more diverse coalition of donors in Seattle. If the program has actually brought new participants into the campaign finance system, that will be our central concern for this talk, and we'll be focusing on the 2019 election cycle. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to first kind of zoom out and tell you very briefly about some of the big facts about money in politics for those of you who are not campaign finance nerds by trade. So we're going to talk about the national context, and then I'm going to zoom in and talk about the local context, what we know about funding in local elections, and Seattle's Democracy Voucher Program in particular. I'm going to give you some context for the 2019 City Council elections in Seattle, which are the ones that we're analyzing. And then I'm going to pass the baton to Brian, who's going to take you through our data and methods and the findings from the 2019 cycle, most of which are based on a policy report that we released through Georgetown a couple of weeks ago. So you can look at the paper version of this as well. So for those of you who still have the stomach to pay attention to the news and the political news in particular, You may have heard that the 2020 election cycle, the one that we just concluded, was the most expensive election on record. So all told, the 2020 election is projected to have cost about $14 billion, $14 billion, not million, $14 billion. So that's an incredible amount of money that represents spending in both presidential and congressional races. But the spending in 2020 is not an outlier. In fact, 2020 is really the continuation or the deepening of a pattern we've seen over the past several decades, which is that each subsequent election is ever more expensive than the last one. So our elections get more and more costly as time goes on. So that, of course, begs the question, why all of this money? Does money buy success? What is the importance of money in these races? So at least descriptively, money is tightly tied to electoral success. And I say descriptively because it's very hard to infer that money is causing candidates to win, but it does seem to be part of the secret sauce. So in this chart, I'm showing you the percent of races that were won by the top spending candidate in House and Senate elections from 2000 to 2020. And what you see is that over time, a large majority of the candidates that win are also the candidates that spent the most money. It's the same for the House and the Senate. There's not very much variation in the winning percentages over those 20 years. So in addition to being quite highly correlated with electoral success, what else does money do? What is the purpose of money in elections? Why do people give money to begin with? One of the things that we know money does is it produces access for those who make campaign contributions. And we know this from two different types of social scientific evidence. The first is interview and survey studies that have been done mainly by sociologists, but also some political scientists as well, that have demonstrated when you ask contributors, why are you giving money in these elections? A good portion of them will tell you the reason is to make sure they have some kind of access or hearing from their elected representatives. We also now have experimental evidence that has demonstrated this relationship. So two very, very enterprising graduate students actually fielded an experiment where members of the House of Representatives were randomized to either receive a communication from a donor or a constituent, and they were able to measure the effect of being a donor on subsequent access to that member and his or her staff. And they found that just what the interview evidence suggests, which is that money buys access. Those people who made a donation had significantly more access to members of Congress. So all of these facts about the importance of money in politics raises a question for those of us who don't study money in politics, which is, where does all this money come from? Where on earth do candidates get the money to finance their campaigns? Well, you should know that in 2016, 0.52% of the American adult population made a contribution over $200. So in the federal system, we call those contributions over $200 itemized contributions. And we have pretty good data on who made those contributions, and we're able to figure out the number of unique people who made a contribution in these races. So a very, very tiny portion of the population, 0.52%, less than 1% of the adult population is making these political contributions. Now, at the same time, those donations over $200 were 70% of federal candidates' money, 70%. So the large majority of the money that federal candidates were raising directly from committees and individuals is actually coming from these larger individual donors. So it actually is the biggest slice of money in the campaign finance system, so individual donors. Now, these donors in the federal system tend to be much older, more affluent, whiter, and more likely to be male than the American population at large, right? So very small percentage of the population is making these donations. It constitutes a large majority of the money in the system. And the people who are making the donations don't look like the voting population at large or the American population. Jake has done some really great work on reconstructing the racial composition of the donor pool and shown that donors have long been primarily white, and they continue to be so today. So all of that was about national or federal elections. What do we know about state and local elections, which is what we'll be talking about today? Well, for the most part, these patterns seem to hold at the state and local level too, but there's considerably less research, which is why Brian and I first embarked upon this adventure. So from our past research on Seattle, for instance, we found that about 1.49% of the voting age population in Seattle contributed in the 2013 Seattle municipal election. So 1.49% of the Seattle population made a donation in a local race in 2013. And that was a donation of any size, not just over $200. So again, very slim portion of the population. And we know from our research and the research of others that those donors in state and local races also share these sort of unrepresentative characteristics of being whiter, wealthier, many more men, so on and so forth. So one potential solution to this, I don't know if you would call it a problem, but one potential solution to decrease the role of private money in American elections is through public financing. So public financing programs distribute public funds to candidates running for political office. So they distribute public funds to candidates, to political candidates, to fund their races for whatever office they happen to be campaigning for. Now, when I say public funds, I mean taxpayer dollars, right? So we take public money and we give it to our candidates so that they can finance their run for Congress or for a state senate or whatever. In the past in the US, there have been really two primary kinds of public financing systems that have been used in our elections. So starting in the 1970s and the 1980s, we get a lot of new campaign finance regulations, and we also get the first crop of these public financing programs to try to address some of these issues of money in politics. So the first kind of system that's been tried is a grants-based system. And in a grants-based system, a candidate would qualify to participate in the program, and then they would receive either a partial or a full grant to offset the cost of running for office. So for example, Connecticut uses this system. Their state senate candidates qualify, and then they receive about $94,000 to run their campaigns. The other type of public financing program is a matching funds program, and that form of public financing, a candidate would qualify, and then any private donations that are given to the candidate below a certain threshold, so mainly low dollar donations, would be supplemented or amplified by public funds. So for example, New York City uses this system in our municipal races. And so a candidate participating in the system would receive 6 public fund dollars for each $1 of a low dollar donation that that candidate received from a donor. So it really amplifies the impact of smaller donors in the campaign finance system. But what I'm going to be talking about today is not these older programs. It's a totally new and exciting program called the Democracy Voucher Program. So the Democracy Voucher Program in Seattle is the first of its kind, and it departs quite radically from how public financing programs have been done in the past. So to give you a little bit of background on the program itself, the Democracy Voucher Program has its intellectual origins in the legal scholarship. So the Democracy Voucher Program is actually the brainchild of a bunch of legal scholars. Bruce Ackerman and Ian Ayres, Larry Lessig, Rick Kaysen, among others, have all kind of theorized this Democracy Voucher Program. The basic idea of a Democracy Voucher Program is that you give voters, or residents in the case of Seattle, you give voters democracy bucks that are coupons that the voters can give to political candidates running for office. And therefore, it frees up money for voters to actually participate in the campaign finance system. So again, what's really unique about this program is that by putting taxpayer funded vouchers in the hands of voters, candidates are incentivized to go and collect money or democracy bucks from citizens across the socioeconomic spectrum, because now everybody has the disposable income to make a donation to a candidate. So Seattle is the very first place to try this form of public financing. So in 2015, Seattle voters approved a ballot initiative called Honest Elections Seattle to implement the first ever democracy voucher program. So this has never been tried before. This is the first of its kind. The program itself was funded by a 10-year, $30 million property tax levy. And under the program rules, what happens is that Seattle residents in each of their local election cycles receive 4 $25 vouchers in a very handsome envelope to allocate to candidates that are running for municipal office. So they can give these vouchers to city council candidates. In 2021, they will be able to use them in the mayoral election as well as city attorney. So these vouchers, again, are mailed to all of the residents, and they can use them to give donations to the candidates of their choice. The first implementation of this program occurred in 2017, and Brian and I have analyzed that round of the program separately. So if you're interested, you can look at that work. So just to put a little bit of a finer point on what's so special about the voucher program in comparison to some of these older public financing programs, we think that vouchers may even the playing field of municipal campaign finance by providing every city resident in Seattle with an equal resource to support local political candidates, right? That's really unique. That doesn't happen in a matching funds program. It doesn't happen in a grants-based system. So by putting those democracy bucks in the hands of voters, it allows everyone to participate in a way that a matching fund system does not necessarily. These vouchers may also increase other forms of political participation by encouraging additional interactions between candidates and citizens, right? So now candidates have to go out there and talk to voters and hustle to get these democracy bucks. And that creates an additional interaction between the formal kind of institutionalized political system and folks who may not be otherwise participants. Finally, vouchers may also lower the barrier to entry for candidates and attract a more diverse group of candidates, although we're not going to be saying much about the candidate side today because we just don't have enough data yet. So the 2019 City Council elections in Seattle are the elections that we'll analyze today. And again, this was the second round of the Democracy Voucher Program, the first one being in 2017. So how did things work in 2019? Well, in 2019, Seattle had 7 districted city council races. And in order for candidates to receive democracy vouchers, they had to qualify to participate in the Democracy Voucher Program. What that involved was that they had to get 150 signatures and 150 low-dollar contributions from Seattle residents to be a participant in the Democracy Voucher Program. So essentially, they had to prove their sort of viability as a candidate before they could participate in the system. 75 of those signatures and donations had to be from in-district. Now, once a candidate was qualified for the program, they also agreed to abide by program limits on contributions and spending limits as well. In the 2019 cycle, the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission dispersed $2.4 million overall to those city council candidates in the districted elections. So again, as I said, there were 7 districted city council positions in 2019, and there were 53 candidates in the primary election. And of those 53 candidates, 35 participated in the Democracy Voucher Program. So about 74% of candidates decided that they did want to participate in this program. So a majority of candidates did participate. And then in the general election, so from the primary to the general, Seattle uses a nonpartisan top 2 primary system. So the 2 highest vote getters in each district will move on to the general election. So from those 53 candidates, we narrowed it down to 14. So 14 candidates in the general election, 2 in each of the city council districts. And what we find is that 12 of those 14 candidates participated in the program. We can say a little more about the 2 that decided not to participate. So that was Kashama Sawant in D3 and Ann Davison Sattler and D5 in the Q&A if you're so interested. So on the voter side, in 2019, the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission mailed the vouchers to residents on February 12, 2019. So a couple days after, the residents would have received their Hanson package or packet in the mail. And then once they had their democracy vouchers, individuals could assign those vouchers to any of the qualified candidates running in those districted races. They could return the vouchers either directly to a candidate's campaign, or they could send them back to the SEEC. The vouchers were also redeemable online or through a paper voucher through the mail system. And importantly for our analyses today, residents could assign their vouchers to candidates outside of the residential district. So for instance, if you lived in D1, but you were not particularly enthusiastic about any of the candidates in D1, you could send your vouchers to a qualified candidate in, let's say, D4. So vouchers can be sent out over district lines. I am now going to pass the pencil to Brian.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So I'm going to take it from here and talk a little bit about the data and the research questions that we asked and the things that we were able to answer in our policy brief, and some additional questions that Jen and I are looking to answer moving forward. So in our policy brief, we asked 4 questions about the 2019 democracy voucher cycle. So first, we wanted to know how the demographic profile of voucher users shifted from the 2017 election cycle to the 2019 election cycle. Second, we want to know how representative voucher users are compared to cash donors of the Seattle electorate, right? One of the goals of the program is to create a donor pool that looks like the voters, right? The registered voters and the voters in Seattle. And so we want to know how demographically representative the voucher users are. Third, we want to know whether or not residents in Seattle took advantage of these program rules to engage in cross-district donation strategies, the kinds of donating or utilizing the vouchers outside of a district that Jen just spoke about. And finally, we want to dig into each of the council districts and think about how the donor and the voter coalitions differ across each of the 7 city council districts. So this is the set of questions that we asked in the brief itself, and I'll start by going through our data and then through these questions. So to answer these questions, we drew on 3 data sources. First, as Jen mentioned at the beginning, we use data on participation in the democracy voucher program. So who it was that used their voucher, the candidates that they assigned their vouchers to, and this data comes from the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission. Second, we used data from the Washington State voter file on previous voter participation. So this includes not only whether a candidate voted in the November 2019 election, but also data on all the previous elections and whether or not they voted in those elections. And this becomes important for us because we're trying to understand a latent propensity to participate in elections. And so previous voter participation helps us understand that. And I'll explain a bit more as we go along. And then finally, we match all of this data with demographic information on age, on income, race, ideology, from a proprietary data source called Catalyst. And so our ability to make comparisons about racial demographics or income comparisons draws on this Catalyst data. So I want to begin by sharing some kind of basic descriptive findings from the 2019 election cycle. In 2019, there were 39,000, almost 39,000 Seattle residents who used their voucher in support of a candidate. This is nearly double the participation rate from 2017. So the participation rate doubles over this one election cycle. And from when 2013, Jen mentioned that 1.5% of Seattle residents gave a cash contribution. Well, this amounts to about 7% of Seattle residents contributing using their democracy voucher. So I just want to highlight that number, and I'll come back to it at the end, because this 7% participation rate in local campaign finance is far and away the highest participation rate in any city in the United States. So 7%, about 39,000 Seattle residents. So in the next set of graphs, we're going to show that the participation rate in the Democracy Voucher Program increased across all demographic groups, but it did so unevenly. And in fact, you'll see that the participation rate increased more quickly among the groups that already had the highest rates of participation in the program. So for the next 4 graphs, what I'm going to show you is the participation rate by demographic group. The light blue bars are the share of that demographic group that participated in 2017, and the dark blue bars are the share of that group that participated in 2019. So what you can see for this first graph, participation rate across age groups, across age categories, is that participation increased from 2017 to 2019 for all age categories, but it increased the fastest for Seattle residents that are 60 years old and older, for the oldest demographic. In 2019, right, we see that about 11% of the residents age 60 and older participated in the voucher program, compared to just about 3% of residents age 18 to 29, right? So we see an increase across all groups, but an unevenness in the increase in participation. The same story holds for race, right? We see consistent racial disparities in voucher usage, and that those racial disparities have widened as well. Not only were white residents more likely to use their voucher, right, but their participation rate rose more quickly between 2017 and 2019 than it did for any other racial group. For whites, the voucher participation rate climbed from about 4% of white Seattle residents to nearly 8% of white Seattle residents between 2017 and 2019. Similar story here for income. Participation rose among all income groups, but again, it rose more quickly among the wealthiest Seattle residents than it did among the poorest. Those at the bottom of the income distribution saw only a modest increase in their participation rate, from about 3% participation to about 4.5% participation. At the top of the income distribution, 2017, about 5% of the highest income Seattle residents participated. In 2019, it increased to about 13% of the highest income residents participating in the program. And finally, I want to show changes in participation rate using previous voter participation. And again, we're using previous voter participation as a proxy for sort of level of interest in local elections and local politics, sort of a proxy for level of involvement in local democracy. We categorize voters into 3 groups. Infrequent voters are those that participated in less than 50% of the previous elections for which they were eligible to participate. Intermittent voters are those that participated in between 50 and 99% of elections for which they were eligible. And consistent voters voted in every single election for which they were eligible. Right? And here again, we see gains across each of these groups, but with the largest gains for consistent voters. So among those who had participated, who had voted in every single election for which they were eligible to vote, more than 18% of them participated in the Democracy Voucher Program in 2019. So our second set of questions asks about the demographic profile of voucher users and compares the demographic profile of voucher users to registered voters and to cash donors. So here, the story is sort of broadly that voucher users are more representative of the electorate than cash donors who contributed $25 or more. We separate out low dollar donors and then those that donated $25 or more. However, as you'll see, right, they're still not fully representative of the Seattle electorate. So the first chart here shows us the share of participants, the share of registered voters, the share of 2019 voters, the share of voucher users, et cetera, that are 40 years and younger. So the dark bar is 40 years and younger, and the light blue portion of the bar is those that are over 40 years old. And you'll see that residents 40 years and younger comprise nearly half of all registered voters in Seattle. They make up 36% of the electorate in 2019, but they're only about 32% of voucher users. So in sort of their age composition, voucher users are not quite representative of the Seattle electorate. The same story holds when we look at the racial composition. Non-white residents make up about 20% of registered voters in Seattle. They make up about 13% of voters in the 2019 election, but they only make up about 10% of voucher users. And noticeably, they make up an even smaller share of cash donors who gave more than $25. And then finally, we look at this by income, and we split folks into 3 income categories. Those in the bottom, the bottom group, less than $30,000 a year. Those in the top, more than $100,000 a year. And again, those with a household income less than $30,000, they make up about 13% of registered voters. They're only 7% of 2019 voters, and they're about 6% of voucher users, right? So again, we find that voucher users are not fully representative of the Seattle electorate here. Third, I want to turn our attention to thinking about voucher users that allocated their vouchers outside of their district of residency. So as Jen mentioned, one important feature of the program is this ability of residents to make a donation across districts to support candidates that might match their ideology or their political preferences that aren't running for office within their districts. Now, overall in the voucher program, about 1 out of every 3 voucher users donated to a candidate outside of their districts. But this feature of the program seems to be most utilized by voucher users in groups that are historically marginalized from the campaign finance system, right? It's these voucher users who seem to be more likely to assign their voucher to a candidate outside of their home district. So when we look at that by age, it sort of shows up in this gradient. Among voucher users that are 18 to 29 years old, more than half of them chose to assign their voucher to a candidate running outside of their district. On the other hand, among the oldest voucher users, those that are 60 or older, less than 30% of them chose to assign their voucher to a candidate outside of their residential districts. A similar pattern holds when we look at white and non-white voucher users. Among non-white voucher users, about 45% of them allocated their voucher to a candidate who is outside of their residential district. Just over 35% of white voucher users assigned a voucher to a candidate outside of their home district. And finally, we see a similar gradient when we look by income. Among those in the bottom income bracket, again, about half of them assigned a voucher to a candidate who is outside of their residential district. Among those in the top income bracket, only about 30% of them assigned a voucher to a candidate outside of their district, right? So together, this tells us that high income, white, older residents are more likely to use their voucher within their residential district, and low income, non-white, and younger voucher users are more likely to participate in the program as a way to support a candidate outside of their residential districts. And so the last piece that we wanted to share from the policy brief concerns the coalitions that are assembled within specific city council districts. So candidates for city council assemble coalitions both of donors, which we can think of as both voucher users and cash donors, as well as voters to power their campaign. And what we're going to show you is that in most city council districts, the coalition of voucher users more closely resembles the coalition of voters within the district compared to the coalition of cash donors, right? So in other words, the voucher users within a district look much more like the voters within a district for most of the districts in Seattle. And so I'm going to just show you one of our graphs here. This is the graph for age. So it tells you the share of the voters, the share of the cash donors, or the share of the voucher users that are 40 years old or younger. So you can see that districts 3 and 4 are a bit of an outlier here, and we can talk a little bit more about the specifics of those races that made them so. But let's take District 2 as a kind of representative example of what's going on within these districts. So in District 2, people under 40 years old, they made up about 36% of all the voters. That's the dark blue bar in District 2. Whereas people under 40 years old, they made up about 37% of the voucher users within that district. And you can see that that pattern holds in 5 of the 7 districts, again, with the exception of District 3 and District 4, right? So here it's a comparison of the donor coalitions, the cash donor coalitions, the voucher user coalitions, and the voting coalitions that candidates assembled within each district. So what I've just presented forms the sort of crux of our kind of demographic analysis for the policy brief. And I believe Veta has put the link to the policy brief in the chat if anybody wants to sort of read further on that part of the analysis. I want to turn my attention now to two research questions that we're working on that extend this analysis from the policy brief, and I think begin to address a lot of the questions that both policy folks and advocates have about the impact of public financing programs. So one question is whether or not public financing programs like the voucher program can build a new coalition of regular repeat participants, right? So we might expect that the voucher program is going to generate sustained involvement in campaign finance over multiple election cycles if individuals begin to use their voucher every single election cycle, right? If they get their voucher and they use it, and they get their voucher and they use it, then they start to form this sort of regular repeat pattern of participation within the campaign finance system. So although we only have 2 election cycles to look at, we can begin a sort of preliminary analysis of this, and I'll show you that in a second. The second question that we regularly get asked is about whether or not public financing increases voter participation in municipal elections. And as Jen mentioned, right, there are several mechanisms by which this might be the case. Public financing may increase contact or sort of touches between candidates and donors in the political system, as those candidates know that everybody in Seattle has $100 to spend. They may increase, right, how often they talk to and call on and invite those donors to events, and that may lead to increased voter participation informally in the election. The other way that this might happen is that public financing may attract new candidates into the election process, who in turn spark enthusiasm among non-traditional voters or traditional non-voters, and that may lead to an increase in voter participation. So I want to share with you some sort of descriptive findings on both of these as we continue this research. So on the question of repeat voucher users, after 2 election cycles, there's little evidence that the public financing program has created a new class of repeat donors. And again, I'm going to, sort of just flag again, it's only 2 election cycles. We'll need many more election cycles to sort of know this. But what we find is that most people who used a voucher in 2017 did not participate in 2019. And most people that participated in 2019 had not participated in 2017. So in fact, only 37%, right, just over a third of 2017 participants, again, used their voucher in the 2019 election cycle. And over 80% of the people in the 2019 voucher program were first-time participants, right? In other words, 80% of people that used their voucher in the 2019 election cycle had not participated in the voucher program in the 2017 election cycle. Another way to think about this is to think about the full set of people in Seattle who used their vouchers in either one or both of the elections that we're thinking about. Overall, when we add them all up, there are about 50,000 people total that participated in either one or both of these election cycles. We find that only 7,500 are repeat participants. Only 7,500 used their vouchers in both the 2017 cycle and the 2019 cycle. Now, on the voter participation question, right, the descriptive work is actually quite encouraging here. Seattle residents who used their voucher in 2019 were much more likely to have voted in the 2019 election cycle. In fact, 88% of voucher users voted in the general election, compared to just 45% of those who did not use their voucher. And 83% of voucher users voted in the primary election, compared to only 43% who did not use their voucher. So descriptively, those people that that used their vouchers in the 2019 election cycle were much more likely to also vote in that election cycle. Now, we know that this is endogenous, right? That voting in the election is endogenous to using your voucher. Sort of another way to think about that is the things that drive people to use a voucher are the same things quite often that drive people to vote in an election, right? It might be an interest in politics, a real commitment to democracy. And so it's hard to sort of really know the impact of the voucher program on voter participation, because the same set of things are driving participation in both of them. So the first cut that Jen and I have taken at this, and this is a sort of puzzle that we're continuing to work on, and happy to sort of hear from you folks and to brainstorm ideas about ways to sort of causally identify the impact here. But what we've done is we've categorized folks in Seattle according, again, to how frequently they voted in previous elections, right? So the first set of bars is people that voted in 100% of previous elections for which they were eligible. The second set of bars is those that sort of casually voted between 50 and 99%. And the last set of bars is those that had only voted in fewer than half of the elections, right? And the real intent in doing this is to think that sort of those categorizations tell us something about kind of their underlying interest, their latent commitment to participation in democracy and elections and local politics, right? And so what we find is that among those people that had voted in 100% of previous elections, voucher users in 2019 were more likely to vote in the 2019 election than those that didn't use their voucher. This is true as well for those that had irregularly participated, right? Those that had only participated in less than 50% of fewer elections. If they used their voucher in 2019, they were substantially more likely to have also voted in 2019 compared to the set of people that didn't use their voucher, right? And so, so this is sort of suggestive, descriptively, it's suggestive that the voucher program is associated with higher levels of voter participation among each of these distinct categories. So I want to wrap up our talk today and leave a couple minutes for Q&A and for discussion with Jake. But I want to wrap up by talking just a little bit about the future of public financing programs, both in Seattle and beyond Seattle as well. So one of the most striking things, I think one of the most striking takeaways from all of this is actually one of the simplest, which is that the campaign finance participation rate increased from about 1.5% before the voucher program to nearly 7% in 2019, right? So again, it's by far the highest participation rate in financing local elections across any city. Jen and I have also just started some work on Washington, D.C., which last year in 2020 had its first matching cycle with a 5-to-1 match. And the participation rate with the matching program went from about 1.5% to 2.5%. So Seattle is sort of by several magnitudes beyond even DC, a place where until recently we loved democracy. The program has absolutely diversified the donor pool, although voucher users are not fully representative of Seattle voters. And so as we think about the program, I think this becomes sort of one of the really persistent challenges of the voucher program, is to think about how it is that to increase participation among historically underrepresented groups in the political process. And then finally, Seattle has an upcoming mayoral election, and this of course will be kind of the next and sort of the biggest test of the voucher program, both determining whether or not the voucher program is encouraging a diverse pool of candidates to run for office. And as a result of that, if it's continuing to diversify, right, the set of donors that are giving in local elections. So 2021 is a mayoral election, which we're excited to sort of continue to watch and to analyze once the election is finished. But there's much more beyond Seattle. While Seattle is the first city to implement a public financing program in local elections like this, there are other cities that are looking at similar programs. So in the past couple of months, Jen and I have had conversations with activists and with policymakers in Austin, in Albuquerque, and St. Louis, all of whom are exploring voucher programs for local elections that are modeled on the experience of Seattle. So that's a sort of call to action for the residents of Seattle to continue to make this program look good. And then the other piece is we want to sort of acknowledge that there was discussion of a similar kind of program in federal elections. And to bring us full circle to where Jen started the talk, when Senator Gillibrand was running for the Democratic nomination, she sort of raised an issue of public financing in federal elections, introducing what she called a democracy dollar program that would provide $600 in public financing for United States residents to give in federal elections, right? So when we think of vouchers as a kind of public financing tool, Seattle is the laboratory of democracy, but there are lots of other places, both locally and federally, with an eye on what's happening in Seattle. So I'm going to wrap up there. I've included our email addresses at the bottom, and this is very much ongoing work, not only on Seattle with some of the questions that we've raised here, but it's actually part of a larger project that Jen and I have started to work on, thinking about the impact of public financing in municipal elections more broadly, comparing different kinds of programs and trying to understand their impact on donors and on the electorate. And so we're very happy to sort of continue these conversations about the entire project, not just about Seattle. So thank you very much for having us, and we're looking forward to chatting more.
Outstandingly important and compelling research here, really showing how campaign finance reform can affect participation, governance, and democracy itself. And also, I just want to give kudos to sort of your faithfulness to Seattleites. Like, I think that's one unique thing, combining, you know, talking about the best quantitative methods of measurement and causal identification here, while also being really faithful to the nuances of, for example, differences in districts and things. So there's so many outstanding questions in the list. We should turn to that. Maria, would you like to enable anybody to ask them, or should I summarize it?
Yeah, so we have quite a lot going on. So generating tons of interest, many questions, some in Q&A, some in chat. So I'm going to try to organize it a bit. So we have a very old question in chat that asks whether the report that we put in chat, the link in chat, whether that's publicly available. Does everyone have access to that?
Yeah, that's on the website of Georgetown's McCourt School, and so that link should give access to everybody. Yes.
Okay, super. So then I've given Anisha and Connor the ability to ask their own questions, and I did that because their questions are related. So Anisha, I think you're first.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Really interesting work. I was wondering, I think you kind of got at this, Brian, near the end there, but if you could just make projections about whether you think there'll be more uptake of the DV program for currently for populations who are not using as much. So for the non-white population, lower income, younger groups, do you think over time, as people get more used to the program, those populations are more likely to start using it, or will there be a plateauing?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and share just sort of some sort of thoughts and conjecture about that. So one thing I do want to acknowledge, so that the Seattle Elections and Ethics Commission did a really outstanding job and put a lot of resources into outreach to these communities, right? There was a lot of work after the 2017 election cycle, sort of recognizing this challenge, a lot of work that was done partnering with community organizations, right, to get sort of word out to communities about the voucher program. The voucher material was available in, I think it was something like 15 languages. So I just want to sort of acknowledge that the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission is doing this work and very much sort of aware of these challenges. And I think that, you know, they're huge challenges partnering with community groups to get word out there. So I do think that there's going to be, you're going to continue to see these patterns in both like good and challenging ways, right? Which is that participation went up, right? We need not forget that participation went up among these groups. It just didn't go up at the same rate. So I think the more that sort of word gets out there, the more that this becomes sort of a norm in Seattle, right? I remember when Jen and I had been to Seattle a couple of times. I was actually on leave at UW in 2018, right after the first cycle of the program. And we've been out a couple more times and talked to candidates and talked with sort of folks working on the ground. And I think that part of it is just awareness, right? Sort of knowing what it is when you get this piece of mail every year, sort of what to do with it. And then part of it is sort of attracting candidates that appeal to these communities, right? And so Jen and I had a really unique experience when we were last in Seattle before the 2019 election, talking with different candidates that were using vouchers and sort of getting involved in the program. And I think part of the kind of long-term idea is that by lowering the barrier to entry into running for office, right, you no longer need to have a long donor list and wealthy friends. So sort of a more diverse pool of candidates coming from different communities and different neighborhoods will run for elective office. And from there, they'll bring in, friends and neighbors and people that support their, political position. So by diversifying the candidates running, we'll continue to diversify the set of people that are donating. So I'm extremely optimistic. I think there's a story actually from DC as well. DC had a matching program for the first time this year and had a huge at-large race with a very, very diverse set of candidates as a result of that as well. So I'm optimistic.
I'll just jump in. There's a number of questions on donating outside of your district and the linkage there. So thinking about that, younger, less wealthy, more racially diverse groups of democracy voucher recipients donate outside of their districts. Do you guys speculate on sort of reasons why, and sort of thinking about that for democracy, what that means? Do people seek, for example, surrogate representation on identity-based shared identities like race and gender and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what that hypothesis that voucher users are sending their vouchers across district lines because they see a candidate in another district that looks like them or thinks like them in terms of policy preferences is a really interesting one. And we're thinking of ways that we can start to test that now. I saw in the chat box, somebody had mentioned maybe this was just a product of timing, that perhaps younger folks are sending in their vouchers later at a time when candidates had already kind of maxed out in their district, and so they sent the voucher over district lines or something like that. I think that could be the case, and we should look at timing of voucher usage as well. But I will say that as far as I'm concerned, I think that our best working hypothesis is this surrogate representation one, that voucher users are sending their vouchers to candidates that they think are most, that would represent them the best. So the reason I think that is because if you look at the candidates receiving those vouchers, they're candidates of color. And so I suspect that there's something else going on. It wasn't a mistake. In other words, I think that people are very purposefully engaging in this kind of cross-district donating.
So I think Connor had a follow-up and maybe some other comments after that. And then then next would be Dan. Dan.
Of course. Hi, Brian. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for the talk. I'm a grad student in sociology and a District 3 resident. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the exceptions, right? So I'm thinking particularly about Sawant in District 3 and what that says about the process overall. And whether that could have driven some of the out-of-district voucher assignments. So for example, if you lived in District 3 and couldn't donate to Sawant, if that might then drive what the demographic composition of who is donating out of district.
Jen, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think part of the question was who didn't participate and why. And so I think others have raised that question too in the chat. So the two candidates are Kashama Sawant and Davison Sattler. And so I think the reasons for non-participation for those two candidates were actually different. Kashama Sawant did not participate and made a very explicit statement at the beginning of her campaign. If you're not familiar with Seattle politics, Sawant is a very well-known socialist candidate. She has a really large kind of national grassroots following. And she decided not to participate because she believed strongly that she was going to be outspent by outside groups that were making independent expenditures. And then if she participated in the program, her hands would be tied because she would only be able to spend $150,000 overall. And these outside groups would essentially like drown her out. And so that was her opposition to the program. In the case of the D5 candidate, I think it was more of an ideological stance rather than something about the program being outspent because of the program limits. So what does that tell us about the program broadly? Well, I will say that the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission has very carefully, first of all, constructed the spending limits for the program so that candidates that are running for city council or for mayor get enough money within the program to run a viable race, right? They looked at past numbers, and the amount of money that they get is based on what they found empirically about how much races cost. So that's to say that candidates are incentivized to participate because they're being given a really good amount of money to run a campaign. As for the IEs sort of drowning out the candidates that participated in the program, the commission has routinely released candidates from the spending limits and the contribution limits when they're in that position. So I'm not sure that Kshama Sawant's objections really held much water. And if you look at the races that attracted lots of IEs, independent expenditures this cycle, and the candidates that were being backed by those IEs, they were phenomenally unsuccessful. So I'm cautiously optimistic that, one, the program has settled upon spending limits that are realistic, unlike some grants-based programs, which really make it difficult to run a viable campaign. And two, that once you have a certain minimum amount of money to run a viable campaign, maybe it doesn't matter that you get outspent by outside groups, as long as you have this sort of minimum threshold amount to get your message to the voters.
Yeah, and if I could add just one thing, Connor, on your question, I think we do have the timing when Democracy Voucher users returned their voucher either to the candidate or to the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission, and so it's sort of an interesting question, and one that we can exploit about timing, right? Because you're right, in District 3 and in District 5, candidate, there were ultimately in the general election, there was only one candidate accepting vouchers, but in both districts there were more candidates, right, leading up to the primary election. So it may in fact be the case that for some set of candidates who sort of got around to using their voucher late, within district they only had one candidate if it was after the general election. We could certainly look into that more and sort of think about the timing and exploit the timing to understand that.
I think Dan is next.
You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you for the presentation and the important analyses you're doing. So one of the first comment is that it would be cool if we had done this by lottery of 50% of people getting them, so we could more experimentally tell what's happening, and maybe some other city or some later iteration we can convince Seattle to do that. And then the question for you is if you were able to somehow get at party affiliation or liberal conservative somehow. I know that's tricky in Washington State, given that we, aside from the voting in the primary, that's not fully public information.
Yeah, so we on the second one, we do have a liberal conservative score from Catalyst. So they've modeled a sort of a liberal conservative scale. As you can imagine, that sort of skews quite heavily towards liberal for voters in Seattle, but it is a variable that we include in some of the regressions that we've run. So it's something that we will be able to include, at least in some sense, moving forward. On the randomization piece, yeah, absolutely. A lot of my work is actually on housing voucher lotteries. So I think a lot about sort of lotteries and what they do and what they don't do, and sort of how it is that we can exploit them. Obviously, there are sort of ethical challenges of that here. And Jen and I have sort of, always in the back of our mind thinking about some sort of unexpected variation that we might be able to exploit. So we don't have a great answer for that yet, but we're absolutely with you and sort of thinking about whether there's some sort of randomization or lottery, even naturally occurring, that we could take advantage of here to understand that process.
So we are about at time and we have lots of questions. So I don't know if there's a suggestion about how we could maybe follow up by email, or maybe, I don't know if Jake has a way of summarizing how it would be best. Some people are asking similar things, but I don't want to cut anybody off. So thoughts, Jake?
No, we should, if you'd like, I mean, it's up to you to take a couple more minutes, but I'll summarize a number of other questions that I think should be emailed to the panelists, but issues of institutional learning about the process over time for different groups, sort of more generally spending limits and other sort of forms of campaign finance and how they would differ from this. The confusing, the sort of confusingness of the system and whether it can be simplified and made lower cost informationally to participate in, things like that. But otherwise, I think we are out of time, unfortunately. But this is great to see so much interest in this. Why don't we put in the chat your guys' emails one more time?
Great.
And then then let's all give a virtual round of applause to our outstanding panelists, Professor Heerwig and Professor McCabe.
Thank you for hosting us today.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
And do feel free to reach out with questions. We can answer over email or have a separate Zoom powwow.
Everybody be safe.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Brian, Jennifer. That was awesome. So glad you did it. Keep us in the loop as the project grows.
We will.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.